Welcome to History 354. Today's lecture video concerns the Cultural Revolution. During the last decade of Mao Zedong's life, 1966 to 1976, he launched a last convulsive political struggle to ensure his legacy and destroy the vestiges of conservative ideas, customs, and even people in China. The Cultural Revolution achieved a level of appalling destruction that amazed the outside world, nearly squandered everything the party had achieved since 1949. Historians talk about the Cultural Revolution as bringing China near a civil war, but that almost makes things seem too orderly and coherent, with clear sides and lines drawn. The divisions were much deeper and messier within all of China's institutions that were the foundation for a modern society. Universities, hospitals, government agencies, even the family. The only one that remained nearly whole and unified throughout was the People's Liberation Army. Much of the violence that can be attributed to Mao and his zealous youth that he called Red Guards was violence unleashed by these groups in China's largest cities, and it found millions more ready to take part, if only to save themselves and avoid being branded a counter-revolutionary during the Cultural Revolution. Factions formed one day and attacked the established. Professors, physicians, mayors, cadre leaders, military veterans, mothers and fathers, and they would dissipate in the next day or the coming weeks. And then a rival would form their own and seek out reprisal against those that had been victimized. A person might be active in calling out the crimes of a coworker one day, and subjecting their neighbors to a vicious attack, and the next days find themselves a victim, publicly shamed in a struggle meeting. For thousands, the pain of it all was too much. The loss of faith and terror that they endured was something that forced them to commit suicide. Others divorced their spouses, hoping to spare their children from shame and being forever branded as the offspring of a class enemy. Unlike the previous campaigns against rightists, Mao set the stage for the people in the streets to use his words as weapons, and for a brief period gave them the political power to decide what and who was right and wrong, and who should be on the revolutionary and progressive road, and those that should be left behind and destroyed. Only in 1969, when the excesses of the Cultural Revolution threatened to seep into the main force units of the People's Liberation Army, did the chairman decide to formally disband the Red Guards. Terror, violence, and social upheaval continued thereafter in sporadic waves in cities across the country for many more years, thanks in no small part to the group that surrounded Mao, the radicals known as the Gang of Four, whose fate actually hinged on winning the struggle for his succession after his impending death. Okay, well, let's go back to the beginning and ask, as historians are wont to do, what in the world Mao was thinking when he launched the Cultural Revolution. It is a question that is the source of endless debate and controversy, and requires for most of us, as far as I know, none of us are egomaniacal dictators, quite a bit of imagination. Among the simplest answers offered is that Mao feared the growing influence of economic planners and partymen such as Liu Shaoqi, Zhou Enlai, Chen Yun, and Deng Xiaoping. These men dismissed the need for class struggle and ideology as they laid out the planning for the state and its new economic development in the early 1960s, with some among them like Deng Xiaoping reportedly saying things like white cat, black cat, either will do as long as it catches mice. A line oft quoted since that time to illustrate Deng Xiaoping's pragmatism, but it's also one that would surely have infuriated Mao Zedong, and he called this type of thinking revisionism. The Cultural Revolution, then, was launched out of jealousy, paranoia, and an insatiable desire for control that led him to persecute millions while creating a cult of worship that elevated him above his peers. Another school of thought emphasizes that beyond his thirst for power, Mao was also sincerely invested in social engineering, and now no longer trusted the Chinese Communist Party to fulfill his ambitions alone. Mao looked upon Chinese society and his own party, even in the early 1960s, with great apprehension because of the emergence of those new elites we've been talking about, and especially entrenched interests in power, bureaucracy. At an ideological level, this disgusted Mao on two levels. One, as someone who prized himself as a sincere enthusiast of egalitarianism, and secondly, as someone who prided himself on being the architect of China's equality since the 1950s. He was a social engineer unrivaled in his power and standing above everyone else, which is ironic, right, given that he believes himself to be an egalitarian. Try to keep in mind that contradictions, though, are not antithetical to ideology, but part of their power and appeal. They ignore or reconcile seemingly illogical positions, and Mao and his disciples saw these things as not exclusive, but as actually working together. He also feared that this meant China was headed down a road trodden by the Soviet Union. Mao saw endemic corruption, hypocrisy, and abuse of power inside the Soviet society, and he thought those things were seeping into his own Chinese nation. His goal then was to smash these elites and entrenched interests, and to use class struggle to once again push China toward a more modern, powerful country that would untap its millions of people and unleash their creative forces. In the past, he had looked to achieve that through cadres, leading peasants in the countryside, but with the Cultural Revolution, he was going to place his faith in people standing outside the party, and primarily urban youth. It violated the principles of rectification that he himself set in Yan'an decades ago, and a third explanation then builds off that and stresses that the Cultural Revolution was actually another stage in the Communist Revolution that was consistent with Mao's theories and Marxist principles, such as democratic centralism. By giving license to youth and groups outside the party to take matters into their own hands, Mao was making politics more democratic and less centralist, less controlled by the party. The Cultural Revolution would allow youth to denounce authority, whether it was the Four Olds, epitomized by the teachings of Confucius, their parental figures and their mothers, fathers, and even teachers, or even the seat of power and leaders like Liu Shaoqi at the top of Chinese society themselves. In this respect, the Cultural Revolution violated one of the basic tenets of classical Chinese politics, the need for a top-down government to shape and lead the masses, and the acceptance of special status, privilege, and the idea of a higher morality as one moved up the social hierarchy. The Cultural Revolution then was an attack on the establishment that hoped to recover a mass-line approach, with locals forming revolutionary committees and taking control over the economy. It was decentralized, it was democratic, it was egalitarian, and it would also create a chance for Mao to cement his values and ideas at the center of Chinese life and destroy any opposition to them that would not only take place during his own lifetime, but in his mind, hopefully outlive his death. Mao would not have been able to instigate the Cultural Revolution, though, if not for the People's Liberation Army and his loyal disciple, Marshal Lin Biao. For years, the Chinese Communist Party and PLA struggled with the dilemma about the armed forces, which was to be the driving agenda: military training and professionalism, or working on ideology and class politics. The fall of Peng Dehuai in 1958 would give the upper hand to Lin, who represented the side that chose ideology and politics. And Lin's control over the political training of the PLA, his development of the Little Red Book, and the deification of Mao within the armed services would be fully complete by 1966. Mao then could call on the army's undying support and loyalty, in no small part because many of them came from poor families in the countryside and owed all their education and upward ability to the army and to the army's elevation of Mao. The second weapon in his arsenal were teenagers and first-year students at university in China's largest cities like Shanghai and Beijing. Much of the principal action in the Cultural Revolution during its first phase, from 1966 to 1968, took place in cities and was led by youth. Over the course of 6 massive rallies between August and November in 1966, Mao worked the nation's youth into a contagious frenzy, telling them to save the country from a conspiracy by groups within. Calling them Red Guards, Mao exhorted them to learn revolution by making revolution. And there were over 10 million that volunteered, having come from all over China, given free transit by the party on railways to come to these rallies in Beijing. Thanks to the PLA, most of these young students were equipped with temporary housing. They were given red armbands, little red books, and the means to make banners and posters emblazoned with Maoist slogans. And to free them up for revolutionary action, schools and universities were soon closed down or forcibly shut by the students themselves. Many of them had been inspired to head for Beijing after word spread in July that Mao had made a trip across the Yangtze River, where he had spontaneously decided that he was going to swim the mighty river. Word of the feat spread like wildfire across the Chinese countryside and was read by many as an omen. It was something that signaled a momentous new event was coming to shake up the world. Mao was superhuman, his focus now set on achieving the impossible. Few rural Chinese at this time could swim, and very few swimmers had ever even thought to try so across the Yangtze River. In the minds of the populace, historian John King Fairbank kind of says that Mao's swim was akin to the Queen of England trying to cross the English Channel. After the early fall rallies then, the Red Guards felt supremely confident in his mandate that he had given them to save the country, and also their own powers to achieve miraculous things by invoking his words and teachings. Inside the army and the party, Mao had already cleared the way for the Red Guards with attacks led by his radical intellectuals under his wife Jiang Qing. A rival to Lin Biao in the People's Liberation Army, Liu Ruqing, was shoved out in 1966 to signal to officers and generals that they should fall in line. Next was Wu Han, vice mayor in Beijing, who was accused of permitting the production of a play about an ancient emperor who wrongfully dismissed a courageous and honest official. It was taken as an allegory for Mao and his dismissal of Peng Dehuai in the Great Leap Forward. Powerful members of the CCP, such as Zhou, Liu Shaoqi, and Deng, took notice of the way that the wind was blowing, so to speak, and they granted Mao the formation of a Central Cultural Revolution Group, an organization packed with his supporters. These preliminary moves silenced opposition in the party and army that could have stymied the Cultural Revolution. And then they were used to widen in the summer of 1966, when Mao declared that the nation must struggle against an unnamed group of capitalist roaders. The cunning of this tactic, keeping those names and targets ambiguous, meant that anyone could be smeared by the accusation of being a capitalist roader or a counter-revolutionary. It fed hysteria and spawned opportunists ready to take up Mao's mission as their own so that they could eliminate their rivals within the party and army and settle old scores. The ambiguity also fed a conspiratorial mentality that made the performance of loyalty more and more, let's call it, exaggerated. Additionally, the idea of struggling against these enemies and it being vague, and who was the enemy, gave a permit for violence for Mao that many interpreted as giving them a right to use murder, torture, and imprisonment to take back the country from conservative elements. Small victories would be won by Zhou and Liu Shaoqi to prevent the full might of the party itself from being thrown into the struggle in the initial phases, but ultimately they too kind of acquiesced in giving Mao license to launch a last, even more expansive ideological campaign since the Great Leap Forward. Outside the party were those that were first to act, radical students who denounced their university administrators and professors with wall posters, accusing them of privilege, poor behavior, and bad politics. By the fall, when the Red Guards were formed, these attacks proved much more destructive. They burst into the homes of intellectuals and officials around Beijing, beating them and forcing them under duress to write confessions and self-criticisms. During struggle meetings, one might be forced to stand on a platform before a stadium of thousands, endlessly repeating your own crimes that you were accused of, while holding your arms backwards above your head to make the wings of a jet. If you couldn't hold the position, known as the airplane position, you were typically bound and kicked into doing so. Others were simply dragged into the streets, beaten, and killed. The simplest things, such as a Swiss knife or a watch, were damning evidence of a bourgeois mentality or a slagius subservience to foreign influences. All things seen as foreign or even just intellectual and educated were bitterly hated. Due to Mao's call to rid China of the four olds, ideas, culture, customs, habits, vast amounts of China's cultural heritage were destroyed. Temples, mosques, churches, jade jewelry, classical paintings, and countless books burned. And this is where I'm going to stop so that I can pick up the rest in part 2.